Today I have the privilege of conversing with Rosemary Sullivan. I was at first concerned when looking at the CV of Rosemary Sullivan that she would be part of a confusing world. She's a poet and an editor, a biographer, an historian, an anthologist, an academic, and she plays a mean hand of canasta. Canasta. Go to Florida. It'll all make sense to you there. But when you read the first few books written by Rosemary Sullivan, you come across an underlying theme, which is most obviously the role of the female artist in the mid to late 20th century, which seems to be a very convenient hook upon which to hang your estimation of the author. But then you continue on from there and you consider that behind the construction of biography and history must be an underlying sense of the politics of community, the fact that a biography and a history is a collaborative project. And you start to sense in the work of Rosemary an underlying theme, which is the theme of community and the politics of community, which are explored in her later books like Cuba, Grace Under Pressure, and Villa Arbel, and Molito. And then you start to look at her index, and you look at the books again, and you realize, first of all, that you know everybody, that she is such a part, an integral part of the Canadian literary community going back, really, I don't want to date you, but I guess going back to the 70s.
I'll date myself.
Okay. Most guests won't do that, but going back to the 70s, and that her own passion and interest in community is spoken to by her involvement at U of T and her, I don't know exactly what you do, you run the MFA program in fine writing, and that Rosemary, aside from exploring the Canadian literary community in the past and exploring the Canadian community overall, is also contributing in a very real way to the perpetuation of community, the perpetuation of Canadian art. And if I thought that was a summary that said everything, we could stop here and not have an interview. But I know I've left a whole bunch of stuff out, right? Rosemary Sullivan, thank you for dropping into exchanging notes.
Thank you.
Before your first biography in 1991, Elizabeth Smart, By Heart, A Life, you published 2 books of poetry. At the time that you first considered writing the biography, do you think that your work in poetry had defined you as an artist? Who did you think you were as a poet?
Whoa, define me. I don't think, you always, poetry is deeply autobiographical in a way other kinds of writing isn't. And the safe thing about it is when you publish it, you think, well, nobody's going to read this anyway, because who reads poetry? Yeah. So, a reputation as a poet. When I published a book of poems as a professor, of course, it was dismissed, right? Anybody can write a book of poems. And then it won a prize, so it was taken seriously. That's the way the public world functions. I was just jumping from book to book. What had happened and this, we were talking about Labyrinth of Desire a bit earlier, I had fallen madly in love with somebody who wasn't available. And it was an astonishing experience. It was meeting the other half. It was a great mind meld. Lasted 3 years with no genuine encounters, and what was this all about? And I went in as late as 1977, I guess, to England, taking a year away from university, fighting so much being an academic that I would have become an academic by rebound. I went to live for a year in England to be alone, and it was very lonely, putting the sea between me and this obsession I had. And I went to visit Elizabeth Smart. And I went to see her because I wanted to see, I had read her book, and I wanted to see how she'd survived it. And Elizabeth was open and amenable to anybody dropping in. And she made Soul Bun Femme for me and so on. And then the one thing she said, which was moving to me, and I really don't think I understood it, I said, how come the guy in the book has no face? I couldn't describe him. She says, because he's a love object. And that was one of the impulses behind Labyrinth of Desire. I wanted to be a myth buster. I wanted to destabilize that myth we have about romantic love, which is an invented myth. So then when I got back to Canada, I tried to get Elizabeth to come here. She eventually came to Toronto. And I was working with Amnesty International because, again, on an impulse, I had gone to the Soviet Union. I didn't like London. You couldn't get inside. It was very hard to meet people. I saw an ad for Aeroflot. And I thought, why not go to the Soviet Union for a week? And I had a friend who knew the BBC producer there, or journalist, worked for Amnesty, and set up a conference here called The Writer in Human Rights in Aid of Amnesty International. When you speak of community, it was one of the great experiences of my life. We had about 70 writers from 20 countries. I mean, Susan Sontag came, Nadine Gordimer, Jacobo Timmerman, Eduardo Galeano, all these people, to see what we could do to create a coherent resistance to human rights abuses. One of the people working on the committee of 10 that I eventually expanded us to was an editor of Penguin and said, why don't you write a biography of Elizabeth Smart? And I wasn't really interested in biography, because at university they talk about the biographical heresy. The writer's life doesn't matter. You're supposed to be interested in the work. And I started reading biography, and I fell in love with the genre. I thought, wow, I read Ellman's Life of Oscar Wilde and thought, here's what I've been missing. I mean, I actually resent, in retrospect, the way universities teach literature, because they shrink it to something too small. So that happened by accident. I said, well, if not me, I knew her, I met her, I loved her. If not me, who? And so I said yes.
You were very closely acquainted with Gwendolyn McHugh, and you said one of the legacies of the love felt for Gwen is the despair of having failed her. Is that the genesis of the biography, that despair? And
No. After writing Elizabeth's life, I really, really loved the idea of trying to write the narrative of another life. It just seemed to me so compelling. You got two temperaments. There's the fiction writer who pulls life in and then reinvents it. Or there's the biographer who has to have the narrative energy of the fiction writer, but loves when the facts are verifiable. Because I actually find life, the narratives, the stories in life are so fascinating. You don't have to make anything up. And when I had Elizabeth walking into Better Books on Charing Cross Road and finding George's poems and starting her search for this guy because she wanted to meet and marry him, though she never had seen his picture. And I met people who remember Elizabeth before meeting George, going around saying, and then George heard that this rich heiress was going after him. I mean, I thought, wow, these are stories. So I thought I was writing, having written about Elizabeth, that was a story of silence, that Elizabeth had really only produced 2 books, though she did do some wonderful poems at the end, and some diaries at the end, after Canada, which was a catalyst for her, returning to her country. Then I thought I was going to write a story of a woman who pulled it off, who was successful, and I turned to Gwen, who had written 20 books, even though she died at the age of 46. And I didn't know this. I hope I didn't give the impression that we were close. We were colleagues. We hung out at the Trojan Horse together. I remember introducing her at a concert for this wonderful Chilean artist, Marcelo Puente, a huge concert on the Danforth. But to be really close to Gwendolyn was very difficult because she never told you her stories. And it was only once I started the book and went to see her sister that I found out how incredibly painful Gwendolyn's childhood had been. You know, that her mother was actually institutionalized. She lived in a house that was 3 tiers. The working class London aunt and uncle lived on the first floor. Her family lived on the second in order to keep an eye on Gwen's mom, Elsie. And on the 3rd floor were kids from the foster institution that were boarded there. You know, it's in this strange house. Here was this magical creature, Gwendolyn, who to me is a great poet. I think her T.E. Lawrence poems and her Afterworld poem, I mean, what an imagination. And she was an autodidact. She quit at school at 17. She would fall in love with a guy, usually because she couldn't speak his language. Then she'd learn his language, and then she'd split because, you know, nobody could be up to Gwen. But she spoke Arabic, Greek, French, Spanish, having left school at 17. And Hebrew. When she quit school, she said, just shy of graduating, she went off to a cheder to learn Hebrew so she could read the Bible in the original. And she was also reading Amharic. She was just... So there was this brilliant, exquisite mind and all these terrors of childhood underneath.
It's a really pivotal time for literature writing. We have the transition from the physical artifact to something digital that doesn't really exist. Are you seeing anybody who's doing anything really new? What does Canadian literature need to do to really stay relevant in the 21st century? I know that's a big one, but you're a professor, so you should know.
I think it's really an open-ended time right now. I mean, there's something called the Canadian Writer and Writing Workshop Program, where people who teach creative writing, whether it's in communities or libraries or universities or colleges, they meet and get together to discuss what state writing is in. You have to go look for sugar daddies who will give money to establish presses like Scott Griffin has done for the Nancy Press and the Griffin Prize. You have to try to build a profile. There should be so much more support for Harbourfront. Harbourfront should be like, the writing program should be like TIFF. It should impact the whole city. Publishers are still doing their job, believe it or not. They're like deer caught in the headlights, and therefore they have to. My publisher in New York, she just commissioned that Amanda Knox book, which is coming out. She doesn't really want to do that book. But that's where, they paid something like $4 million for it. But that's gossip. That's the book that works, right? And every celebrity now has a book. They still are creating real books behind that.
It's a discouraging time, though, don't you think? Because there really is so much writing now, and I think reading is still thriving. But we just seem to be subsumed by this tidal wave of crap. It's about the only thing I can come up with. And I mean, where does a literary writer really go to access the market?
Well, that's why, it is a hard time because Ben McNally, isn't it, that's just going on there?
Nicholas Hoare?
Nicholas Hoare. You can't, you go to a bookstop so you can feel the book, so you can browse and decide whether you like the first 5 pages. You don't like it, you don't get it. I've read a book in paperback, lost it, picked it up on Kindle, and it wasn't the same experience. I just think I'm a troglodyte, but, I think the scariest thing is, and I don't like to be scared. So I refuse to be a Jeremiah. If the human brain is changing, well, it's changing. But I don't think kids who are caught up in, anyone under 40, who are caught up in iPhone technology, tablets, etc., I don't think they have the attention span for the books that I read. as a kid. I don't think they're going to pick up Dr. Zhivago. They might watch the movie, which is a parody of the book. They're not going to read Dostoevsky. They're not going to read, the books get thinner and thinner. And if I look among you, some of you are my generation, we'll see what evolves. But this whole issue of the attention span that's required for, who reads poetry right now? And yet the arts always survive. I mean, we still have opera, we still have symphonies, we still have... And there's a great place on the Danforth called Avli, 401 Danforth, where you can get the most wonderful Greek, Serbian, Latin American music with my husband playing the percussion.
That was not a plug. What are you working on now? What's on your desk?
I am writing a biography of Stalin's daughter.
Could you explain that to me?
My publisher liked Villa Herbel. She phoned me a year ago, November, and said, I'm going to give you 2 words. Will you do it? She said, Stalin's daughter, who had just passed away in 2011. I made that trip to the Soviet Union in 1977 because I am absolutely fascinated by... and I said to her, Claire, I don't speak Russian. She said, yeah, that's why I'm asking you. She didn't want a historian's version. She wants a biographer's version. And I'm actually going to Russia for 5 weeks in May. And I have set up interviews with families, and I have my Russian assistant who's coming with me. And I have been immersed in nothing but Russia for a year and a half. And it's the mantra that Svetlana wrote, no matter where I go, no matter to Australia, to an island, anywhere, I will always be the political prisoner of my father's name.
Why do you think you're drawn to exiles? I mean, if we start with you...
I married one, or I will.
Well, you married an exile, yes, but you were exiled from yourself for 30 years by you just said, because you didn't realise, it took 30 years for you to realise that you could be a writer. So I was just wondering, and if we look at Gwendolyn Fluency, yes, she was in some sense an exile. Elizabeth Smart certainly was. You win in Villa Herbel, you certainly wrote, they all became exiles of one kind or another. What is it you think about exile, the state of exile that gets your attention?
It's a lovely question. I've never even thought of myself as an exile. I mean, I came to believe I could be a writer when I met a woman, poet, Jenny Cousin, who said to me when I must have been 27, always love your poems, even if you think they're scruffy and mangy like little dogs. They're your poems. I needed somebody to let me believe in myself. So I was exiled from myself. I didn't start like Atwood at 16 walking across a park and getting a poem knocked into her head, She had that family environment that created confidence. If there is an issue that has obsessed me, possibly no longer after Atwood, the Red Shoe book, how do you have the confidence to believe in yourself as a writer? And that's what I think the function of creative writing programs are, to nurture that support system. They're not about teaching somebody to write. The talent's already there, but to give people the confidence to take risks, to step over the edge, to believe, I mean, what the hell am I doing writing a biography of Stalin's daughter? But,
another exile.
Yeah, and I'm standing on the edge of a cliff and jumping in and loving it, but I'm terrified of it as well. I mean, what writing is about is having somebody give you the confidence to push you to the edge of yourself. I've never thought of the journey of exile. I have always somehow, and I think it's the Irish family thing, felt on the margins, or preferred the margins. I love the idea that in Canada, my rant on Canada is, it's too easy now, but used to be good. That in the great continental house, Canada's the attic where the Americans put what they don't need, but know they can get it at any time, and Latin America is where they bury the bodies in the basement. I'm not quite so anti-American or simplistic anymore, but it was I always liked to be, on the Canadian. I always loved the idea that we Canadians took our responsibility of as watchers almost. We weren't the big players. We accepted the role of being on the margin. We celebrated it. We didn't carry ideological baggage. We were chameleons who could allow other cultures to have their own identity and roots without feeling threatened by it. I think one of the things that is still odd about American culture is they don't really know the rest of the world exists. But everything's gotten so much more complex now. But Exile, that's interesting. Thank you for that idea, because I always thought it was margins, but maybe it's a journey.
Thank you all. That was a long one.